Hi, this is Ferdinand Engländer from Animator Island. You probably wonder why I speak to you in video form. I am here at the FMX in Germany and I report for you live. Well, at least it's live for me. The FMX is a conference, one of the industry's largest, where animation, VFX and transmedia artists from all over the world come together. While a lot of the presentations are about specific projects, some speakers discussed more general topics. Andrew Ruhemann, CEO of Passion Pictures, talked about the challenges of creating appealing characters that connect with the audience.
I am speaking about a subject very close to my heart, which is character, craft and connection. That's the title of my talk, and it does what it says on the tin. I'll be speaking about those subjects specifically.
What is your point of view on the animation world? Why did you choose to specifically become a producer for animation?
I'm a producer and a director now. I recently started directing, so I did a short film called The Lost Thing a couple of years ago, and I've always been a sort of creative producer, I guess. That's been more my kind of interest. And my relationship with animation is interesting only in that I had no experience with drawing or animation at all when I got into the business. I was lucky to work with one of the great masters, with Richard Williams. So I worked with him on Roger Rabbit. I ran his studio for 3 years, 3 or 4 years even, when I was 27. And that was my introduction to animation. That's what got me focused on it when actually it hadn't been much of an area of interest before. It's become probably my first technique for telling stories, because I think of myself as a storyteller, and because of my experience in animation, I feel very comfortable telling those stories in the animation medium. Well, the advantages for somebody like me are fairly basic. Is that my eye is now very attuned to what I think is I suppose in spotting good characters and spotting good design, in knowing how to talk to the animators who can give me the performances that I want. I don't have the confidence in live action yet, if ever I go that way. You know, I feel much easier in this environment, you know, putting in the pieces that can create a story. I'd like to learn other techniques at some point, but I do enjoy working with the animation world from that regard.
What would you say are guidelines for a successful, appealing character?
The guidelines for a successful, appealing character are extremely difficult. It's kind of like saying what's the guideline for being Tom Cruise or being Julia Roberts or being somebody who's got a natural sort of charisma and appeal. And for me, that's something that's very hard to teach. You know, I can't give a formula of saying it's got to have eyes like this and a nose like that, or, you know, fur like this, or a body like that. That's where the magic comes in, and that is the basis of my talk this afternoon, is that there is a certain bit here that is in that magical art world where it's coming from the soul of the artist that creates a character that appears to be alive and has a connection. And again, that's another part of the talk, is the fact that a good drawing, a good model, a good sculpture will speak to you emotionally, and a less good one won't. And I'm interested in the ones that can help convey my story, because you care about them in some shape or form.
Can you give us an example for a very appealing character? Maybe what would be a good inspiration?
For good character appeal, I think somebody like Pierre Coffin is a master of appeal. You know, the guy, for those that don't know, who directed Despicable Me 1 and has now just finished Despicable Me 2. I think if you look at his early work, everything he touches makes you smile. And you can go back further. You know, if I put up a picture of Wile E. Coyote or, you know, Bugs Bunny or any of the big iconic characters, they leap off the page, and I defy anybody to look at these drawings and not have a little smile when they first see them. And if somebody's smiling, it means it's spoken to them and it's connected with them.
Could you please give us some advice for young filmmakers that want to start making their own films? My advice to
young filmmakers is, what is it? It would be long. I'm very boring like that. I'm quite I'm like a big teacher. I would start by saying, just do it, you know, just get on with it one way or another. There's no excuses these days. You know, it's not like you need really expensive kit anymore if we're talking about animation in particular. But even if you're in live action, you know, you can get hold of all the bits that you need. You can cut things yourself and just practice telling stories. I would say learn who to listen to for advice, because I think directors who get too isolated can eventually end up going off the rails, and that includes really big directors who stop listening. Even the Coppolas and the Scorseses and the Spielbergs of this world can make less good films if they stop listening to the people they used to listen to, who will just nudge them, because anybody who's making films knows you can get completely lost in it. I would say, pick your team carefully, because it's a team business, but have the courage of your convictions and work with rigor about narrative and telling stories. Rigor, so everything is always guided towards telling your story and developing your characters. And if it doesn't do that, if your shots don't do that, then don't use them. Unless you want to be Jean-Luc Godard and do a new wave thing, which is fine too. But for my style of filmmaking, it's about rigorous storytelling.
How do you think the future of the animation business will look like?
I'm never good at predicting the future. I can only say that I think the future is bright, and that we've got to remember that we're at the infancy of this medium, really. We've been going 100 odd years, just over. And that is very young for an art form. And I think we've got a long way to go. And with the whole digital revolution and the availability of these of sort of cheaper ways of producing these things, we're going to see a lot more films made by less established directors and less established studios. And I think that's a really good thing.
Thank you very much, Andrew Ruhemann, CEO of Passion Pictures. Next up, we'll be talking to Craig Caldwell from the University of Utah. Here at the FMX, he spoke about storytelling.
I've got two talks. One is about the story elements, really what are the fundamentals that go into a story, and the other part is how you put them all together, how you develop a story, and what are some of the procedures to help you along that way. One is the ingredients, and the other is sort of the recipe. How are you going to put them all together? But you first have to know what all those ingredients are in terms of inciting incident, what sort of gets your action going. The fact that you really do go from an ordinary world to a different world to come back to some other world that could be the different status quo. Even if you're not doing a feature film, you're sort of thinking, okay, there has to be a change, there has to be a challenge along the way.
What would be a good approach to writing stories? And is there something special about the animator's perspective on a story?
As an animator, you're going to start really on the microscopic level in the area of acting. So in terms of how two people interact. As you flesh out the story, you will have a sort of a checklist thinking about, okay, what are my turning points? Something dramatic has to happen rather than something cool is happening and it looks really good. What is the change? Whether it's emotional, whether it's dramatic. The ideal would be that there's a change in direction in your life. And we look at dramatic stories because they're not our lives. Our lives, we come home, we tell our events, but they're not necessarily connected. So you're looking for some sort of change or insight that takes place. And of course, when people talk about character arc, often as an animator, I go, what is a character arc? Well, it's really that change somebody goes through, and it could be about the person yourself, or in terms of Wall-E, the change doesn't happen to him, but it happens to Eve, who's sort of cold and robotic, and she sort of lightens up and goes, oh, and that's sort of the brilliance of Pixar, is they take those classic elements and then they sort of move them around. Another element would be the difference between archetypes and stereotypes. Archetypes being, a father figure, who's going to be the villain, who's going to be the protagonist. And in Megamind, they did such a brilliant job that if you understood them, you started off with a hero. And then he disappeared. And Megamind, who was supposed to be the evil shadow figure, he didn't have a job anymore. He didn't know who he was supposed to be. And so by learning about stereotypes, he was able to play with that, so that the sidekick in the one, he got, oh no, I'll turn him into the hero, and then I could play off him, whoop, and then he switched roles, and then the original hero comes back, but he's really the shapeshifter along the way. So by understanding those, you really sort of play off one against another.
What would you say is the most important element of a story?
What I look at is, as an animator, we're far more visual. And most of the elements of story come from a writing background. So I really got into this because I wasn't as familiar about it. Being an animator, coming from a visual background, those were sort of secondary. But as I looked at more and more films, I realized these were gorgeous films. I loved them. But what was at stake? What was at risk? There are films where they're just gorgeous. I love them, but at the end I'm like, why am I watching it? What do I care? There was nothing at risk. The character is the same at the beginning as they are at the end. So just by sort of looking at your checklist, thinking there has to be something at risk. In Toy Story 2, we knew the characters couldn't die. You know, we were in love with the characters. So they had to come up with, something has to be at risk. And that was a really long problem for them until they realized not being loved. That's what was at risk. And that was just devastating, because if somebody doesn't love you, that's like dying. You want it to feel like life and death, even if it isn't life and death. So you think of things where you're either rejected or something happens, or what changes along the way that take place that makes that happen.
So coming up with new forms of classic story elements, is that like a storytelling secret?
You take them and how you put them together. Now, I wish I could give a really nice analogy about being a cook, because it's how they put those elements together. My wife can put elements I would never think in terms of the ingredients, but it comes off wonderful. And that's what we're doing with story, and that becomes the vehicle that the animation becomes a really powerful part of, to really get the idea out, and then we connect.
What is your favorite animation short in terms of storytelling?
I think I always love Octopi, the two octopuses, and they have the inciting incident, you know, where they get pulled out of the tank, and it happens immediately. And then the risk is life and death. But the choice that the one makes for the others, I gotta come after her and rescue her. And then along the way, the interesting parts of the animation is when they're jumping from one swimming pool to another. Now that's fantastic animation, but something is at risk. They don't want to get killed. So we not only have cool animation that we really want to watch, but we're really involved in the story until the final narrative question is what's going to happen. And then the cart falls into the ocean, but then you think, oh, it's all over, and the seagull grabs the one. But if you really watch all to the end, and I took every single frame and I watched exactly, I had that feeling, you know, that he was going to pull back on the electrical line and launch themselves off, and it goes, yeah, it matches right until you actually, the last frame is there. But if you look at that film, there were 6 directors. They said it took forever because we were meeting all the time. But the insight was when something didn't work, I'm sure one of them said, this isn't working. The other's like, no, I love it. I'm sure this has got to stay. And it's like, no. I can't even imagine how laborious that must have been.
If I would have a project team and I would need to come up with a story, what is the best way of doing that? How do I work with the team to make this story as good as possible?
What I'm trying to share here in my talks are what are the actual elements that make it up and go down through it. Now I call that a checklist. There's actually a book that came out a few years ago called Checklist Manifesto. And you think about, it sounds like, oh, this is really boring. I'm going to follow a checklist. But if you think about your doctor, if he's operating on you, you want them to follow a checklist and make sure they've taken everything out. Your airline pilot, you want them to follow a checklist. Yes. So for us, it's a checklist, but you're not going to use everything or care about everything, but at least you've considered everything along the way. That you go, yeah, I've thought about it. The directors and story people in Toy Story talk about how they didn't want what they didn't want in their film. They didn't want a character who wanted something. But when they took that part out, they had to put something else in. And that's what you've got to balance, is make sure, oh yeah, I'm rejecting that, but what are you making up for it to complete the audience's experience? There's an example that the current writer of the new Star Wars movie, Michael Arndt, and he was a writer on Toy Story 3. And he said he got stuck on a problem, and he went with 2 other writers, and they said, it was a scene with a station wagon, and he didn't know how to solve it. And what they did was they went to the back of the station wagon and they said, what elements are in there? And they started listing the elements. And all of a sudden they said, oh, that's in there. That's how I'm going to solve it. So sometimes you get stuck and you sort of just go through and find out what it was. Same thing happens with turning points. You know, you have major setbacks, reversals. They're a standard set of turning points. And sort of go, which one do I want? But don't follow them as a formula, because that's a Star Wars movie, and that's already been done, but we sort of pick and choose our way through it.
Yeah, that would be my concern, that if you use a checklist, isn't there the danger that it could feel too forced or unnatural?
Well, I wouldn't want you to force it in, just that you've considered it. That's all I meant, is you thought about it. The same thing would happen if you're an animator and you're working and you're coming from a painting background, you have a canvas. Well, you decide whether you want the white on the canvas or not. You know the canvas starts white, and even if you cover it up, you can put white back on. So in a checklist, you would just go, well, no, I considered it. And that's all. Because sometimes it's hard to think about those in the same way as an artist. You'd be thinking about line and shape and value and texture, lighting, all those different elements, but you can't think about them all at the same time. As I said, the one you don't want to forget about is what is at stake. What is important that your audience is going to connect with and care about your characters, that there's something at stake. That's the one I usually see that people haven't thought about. It's all cool, but there's nothing at stake.
Do longer films need to have more story elements than shorter ones?
Oh, you would need to consider them. In the same way, a very short film may have one act, but a feature film is going to have at least 7 acts in terms of what happens. If you have an hour drama on TV, it's got 4 acts that take place, even though there's always the beginning, middle, and end that is sort of general. And then what's happening now is, in the last 20 years, you know, you have an act 1, act 2, act 3. So you've got that structure, but stories may have a beginning, middle, and end, but they're not in the same order anymore. That you could get the end, and then the beginning, and then the middle, and then a little bit more later on, and it's all sort of turned around and in different orders. But don't forget to put an ending on your film. That gives your audience meaning. Without the meaning, they're going to be really upset. And why did I watch this film? If there was no meaning, you didn't give me that. And sometimes you fall in love with your film and you don't think about that ending, and it just like, well, it just ended. And you're like, why did I watch it? That's the one thing. You can change just about everything else and mix it up, but give them some meaning. Now, on the thought about a checklist that you would use, it has to be your checklist for story. There's the hero's journey, which is a long checklist. And then there's ideas for the animated short out there by Karen Sullivan, which is how they put their shorts together at Ringling. She has a much more condensed checklist. Then there are the Pixar 22 rules out there, which is Emma, I'm going to blank out on the last name, her rules for putting story together. And each one are different ones, and from those you'll say, this one's important to me, or this one. Because at the end of Hero's Journey, there's one that's about return with elixir. And I'm like, what the heck does return with elixir mean? I go, I will not use that. I have to come up with something else. Now, something I'd like to share is when I first started at Disney, I was in artist development, and I had been there a couple months, and they had hired a group of junior animators that had come in, and they were taking the senior animators who had been there a while to come in and talk. And I remember Ellen Woodbury came in, and she was ready to talk about what was really important. So we got in a room, and I got back, and I got my notebook all out, and I was ready to take the notes, and she brought out this bag with balls. And she said, this is how you do a bouncing ball. And I was like, what? This is supposed to be the secrets? And she pulled out the bouncing ball and started talking about it, on how fundamental it was. And if you didn't know about arcs, you didn't know about exaggeration, if you didn't know how to do a bouncing ball, it wasn't going to work. And I thought, wait a minute, these junior animators, they have 4 years of professional art school. They've worked out in the industry, and this is what they're talking about? That, yes, you can't gloss over if you don't know about the bouncing ball, if you miss the assignment about weight or about two characters playing off one another because they have two character qualities. Don't overlook those. That's what they look for immediately, especially on the higher end in animation, or some way to incorporate those.
Thank you, Craig Caldwell. And that's it for this episode. Thank you very much for watching. I was wondering how many people actually watched these interviews till the end. If you did, please like the video or leave a comment so we know. That would be great. And also, of course, if you have any suggestions or opinions that you want to share. In the next episode, I talk to acting teachers.
Acting is behaving believably in pretend circumstances for a theatrical purpose.
In animation, you need to plan everything ahead. In improv, you cannot plan. You can learn to think quick, to be more, flexible, creative. And at the same time, you create these stories together with your colleagues.
Don't forget to check back on animatorisland.com for updates of the FMX report. We also have great articles where you can learn about animation, storytelling and acting. This was Ferdinand Engländer for Animator Island. See you next time. Take care and goodbye.